I will give the floor to Patty, who will speak for 40 minutes, after which we'll have a time for discussion and questions. Once Patty is done, you can indicate you'd like to speak by using the raise hand function or typing message in the chat. Patty, please take away.
Thank you, comrade, and thank you, everyone, for joining this meeting today. As has been mentioned, I'm speaking to you from Sydney in Australia. This where I am now, this land is Bidjigal land. That's the name of the Aboriginal people who continue to live and occupy these lands and defend them. It's also the first point of contact when the British first came here and invaded the continent of Australia. It was through Botany Bay, which is just down the road from my house. And they've actually named the just about 800 meters from where I am has recently been turned into a luxury apartment complex that they've named Discovery Point, because it was the place that Captain Cook actually sailed up and found the first sort of fresh water source where he wanted to sort of create the new British colony here. So yeah, there's been more than 200 years of struggle against imperialism led by Aboriginal people on these lands, and I would just like to start by acknowledging that. And yeah, thanks for the introduction. I think, obviously both of our organisations are socialist organisations operating on stolen Indigenous lands, operating in settler-colonial contexts. And I think it's really important, to be doing what we can to try and theorise, the system of settler colonialism, how it works to oppress Indigenous people, how it works to oppress all working people and oppressed people, and the basis on which we can actually build solidarity between the revolutionary working class movement and Indigenous struggles, continuing Indigenous struggles for justice and sovereignty. And that really it was in that spirit that I started my PhD research, which has just finished. I was awarded my PhD earlier this year when I was looking into the history of the Communist Party of Australia, which was the main socialist current in Australia from about 1921 when they formed. I was looking at the emergence of a position of solidarity with Indigenous struggle in Australia as it developed within the Communist Party of Australia. There was, the first big major fights for Aboriginal rights that were actually taken up by the working class movement were led by communists and were led on an anti-imperialist basis, and were led, with a theory that was decisively informed by the foundational work of Marx and Engels, trying to actually analyse the relationship between racism and colonialism and the capitalist system. It's clear when you go and actually read communists in Australia grappling with the situation they find themselves in and the continuing genocide against Aboriginal people, which was in full swing in the 1920s and the early 1930s. There was still massacres happening on the so-called frontier in Australia. There was a program of deliberate mass forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families in an attempt to eradicate Aboriginality from the Australian continent through a program of social engineering. So it was a time of, profound racism and genocidal violence. And you can look at, the communists grappling with this and really using the analysis of Marx and Engels and the Communist International they were a part of to try to understand it and fight it. So, a big section of my thesis is looking at the first major campaign for Aboriginal rights, which happened in 1933, where basically there were protests across Australia led by working class organisations, which actually stopped a massacre that was threatened, being threatened in Northern Australia. The government actually shipped guns and ammunition from Sydney to Darwin in Northern Australia for the purposes of a massacre. And there was a big protest led by radical workers that stopped it on an anti-imperialist basis. So that's what I was really interested in is, where did these ideas come from? And it led me to actually looking at the foundational work of Marx and Engels, which I'll explain some of today. There's also going to be some comments in my in my talk that's a bit more of a critical analysis actually of some of the work of Marx and Engels as it related to settler-colonial situations, particularly Anglo settler colonies in the United States and in Australia, where I think even though there was a very profound critique that was developed by the revolutionary movement led by Marx and Engels at that time of racism and of colonialism in general, there was a blind spot when it came to the question of settler colonialism. I guess not really recognizing that it too was an imperialist process that was being resisted by Indigenous peoples, who deserved and needed solidarity. And actually, solidarity with Indigenous peoples would have been just important then as it was now. But for various reasons relating particularly to the weaknesses of the workers' movement that they were part of, and the particular structural position of the workers' movement actually in settler colonies, particularly in the United States, and the importance of campaigning for free soil, campaigning for land in the US territories to actually be opened up for working class people to take up as settlements. I sort of will go into have some discussion today about the way that this, I think, sort of distorted the view of imperialism as it related to the North American continent and Australia, and sort of masks the reality of that imperialist violence and the need for solidarity. So I'll talk a little bit to that. But overwhelmingly, the message I'm trying to get across today is about the importance of Marx and Engels' ideas and the way that those ideas really need to be understood in the context of the struggles that they were part of. That the best insights in Marx and Engels come about at the high points of struggle. They are generalizing from the best insights of working class activists actually on the ground. So to just get into starting the talk proper, I'm going to look at the evolution of Marx and Engels' thought, really, which was over 4 decades. They started working together, theorizing and writing together in 1843, and they were collaborators, close collaborators, all the way through to Marx's death 40 years later in 1883. And you can see, them starting to theorize capitalism, their brilliant insights into the destructive nature of capitalism, the exploitative nature of capitalism, and the creation of the working class as a revolutionary subject. Right from the start, that was theorized capitalism as a world system. Capitalism as a system that was interested in expanding across the world and dominating the entire world and dragging all of the world's people into one global world market, are subordinated to the needs of capital accumulation. And that was very much present right from the start. Obviously the very famous pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto, with this sort of searing insights into the reality of the emerging capitalist system and the injustices of that system. It had an internationalist catch cry of workers of the world unite, and an internationalist flavor right from the start that, continued to really inform the anti-racism of the Communist Party in the time when I was struggling, right? When I was studying, right? So that slogan, workers of the world unite, was at the front of the newsletters that communists in Darwin were handing out when they were agitating against the raid on the punitive raid and the massacre on Aboriginal people that I discussed in 1933. That was actually the banner headline, sort of on their newsletter. So you can see the importance of these ideas of global solidarity right from the start with the Communist Manifesto. I think I've been quite influenced by, and I think it's actually quite a useful critique and summary of the ideas of Marx and Engels and their development is by Kevin Anderson in the book Marx at the Margins. He speaks about the Communist Manifesto and sort of speaks about how, like, even though it's, very, very prescient, and very, very brilliant in the way it actually theorizes capitalism as a global system, at this point in time, there is not a developed critique of imperialism in the Communist Manifesto or in the work of Marx and Engels. So while on the one hand, capitalism is, they celebrate the productive power of capitalism, the way it's able to throw off the fetters of the old feudal society in Europe. There's this sort of breathless celebration of capitalism on the same time as it's juxtaposed to the sort of the degradation, the alienation, the exploitation that's experienced by the proletariat. with the discussion of capitalism expanding around the world, there's not really that other contradictory side that's brought in. You know, there's no real critique of colonial violence or colonial racism. You know, and in fact, you know, Kevin Anderson sort of says that, this is a quote from his book, they seem to view Western colonial incursions into Asia, including England's notorious First Opium War against China in 1839 to 42, as on the whole progressive and beneficial to the undermining of Oriental barbarism. And two, that they assume that the rest of the world would sooner or later follow in the footsteps of the more technologically advanced Western European nations. So I think it's fair to say that at this point in time, I'll just read another quote, sorry, in 1848, so this is the same year as they're writing the Communist Manifesto, there's an article by Engels which actually welcomes a French army victory in Algeria against Algerian people. And he says, Engels says, the conquest of Algeria is an important and fortunate fact for the progress of civilization. The modern bourgeois with civilization, industry, order, and at least relative enlightenment followed him is preferable to the feudal lord or the marauding robber with the barbarian state of society to which they belong. Right. So at this point, you know, capitalism's critiqued, but it's sort of presented as like historically progressive and in fact historically necessary, you know, for this imperialist sort of expansion that's happening around the world, that there was something progressive about the bourgeois, you know, invasion of Algeria and suppression of the Algerian people. Okay. And one thing that never changes, and I think is very, very important in the work of Marx and Engels and remains true today, is that what capitalism accomplished in Europe in terms of overthrowing the feudal system and creating a system of production with this incredible resources, you know, incredible productive powers at its disposal. This was really necessary in terms of creating the raw material or the basis which made socialism possible. You know, suddenly the working class, you know, could take in its hands a productive potential through a revolutionary process, which could do away with want and poverty worldwide. Right from that period in 1848, they believed revolution was possible. Socialist revolution was possible in Western Europe to sort of take the reins of this, you know, amazing new productive capacity. However, and they never changed from that view. However, what did change from the 1950s was a belief that bourgeois domination around the world, the expansion of bourgeois imperialism around the world, was something that needed to be supportive and that was in itself a progressive thing. And they actually shift quite decisively in the 1950s when you have the experience of some major rebellions in Algeria, major rebellions in China, and particularly the most influential major anti-colonial rebellions in India, the Sepoy uprising in 1857. You actually start to get an articulation from both Marx and Engels, they're very excited about these new revolutionary actors, really, on the global scale, people who are actually fighting the system of British imperialism that the workers' movement is fighting in Britain, and the system of European imperialism that the workers' movement across Europe is fighting, right? So they drop this idea that we are with the bourgeoisie against the Algerian, you know, marauding barbarian hordes, as Engels put it in the late 1840s, and start to actually recognize, you know, as Marx says to Engels in 1857, India is now our greatest ally, right? They actually start to see that anti-colonial resistance. And here you start to get, this is a proto-emergence of a theory of revolutionary workers' solidarity with anti-imperialist struggle that becomes more developed in the 1860s and becomes absolutely crucial for the emergence of the anti-imperialist position of the Communist International after the First World War, etc. Okay. So it takes a really, really big leap forward. The sort of what would you say, the nuance and the sophistication of the anti-imperialist position that they're developing takes a really big leap forward with the formation of the International Working Men's Association in 1864, 1865 in London, which Marx and Engels played a crucial role in, right? So this was a very profoundly internationalist organization, which actually sought to unite working people across the world. I mean, in reality, it was in Europe and in North America, in terms of who was actually members, but the rhetoric and the rules were very, very clear that it was open to all people, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, right? International solidarity was very, very important for the International Workingmen's Association. It actually formed in response to a number of things. Firstly, growing international competition, growing international cooperation between different socialist groups, anarchist groups, and labor movement organizations, trade unions as they were forming, for a number of reasons. They were increasing cooperation to stop the phenomenon of scabbing that was happening, where workers from the European continent were being brought into Britain to break strikes, right? So it was directly in response to international scabbing operations, trying to build a sense of international solidarity to actually stop the undermining of union power, but also in response to some really profound internationalist campaigns, big meetings that were held in London in solidarity with the Polish independence movement, in solidarity with the Irish independence movement, and most influential, in solidarity with the movement to stop the entry of the British into the American Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, right? This was a very large scale and very important movement in Britain, led by labor movement leaders in the middle of the Civil War. You've got the slaveholding South against the free labor North, and the British government, there was a blockade, right? So the Northern armies were blockading cotton from being exported from the South to Britain. This was causing an enormous amount of hardship in Britain, right? All of the working class areas with big cotton factories, people were unemployed, right? It was causing an enormous amount of hardship. And the pressure was coming, the British government were going to break the naval blockade and intervene on the side of the South. And what stopped them, and Marx was clear about what stopped them, was a movement amongst working people, led by working people in solidarity with the North against the slave holding South. Right, on an anti-racist basis, on an anti-slavery basis. That was the basis on which they fought the entry of the British into the US Civil War. And this ferment and this movement played a very, very important role in actually in the formation of the International Workingmen's Association. In fact, in many ways, even the language of self-emancipation, the act of the liberation of the working class must be the act of the working class. Self-emancipation, this language in many ways actually came from the Civil War period and came from the mass uprising of slaves themselves who absconded from plantations in their thousands and their hundreds of thousands. Du Bois called it a general strike of slaves, which actually ended the US Civil War. And there was, this sort of, amazing sort of radical movement in the United States, which carried through the end of the Civil War period and spilled over into a radical labor movement struggle demanding the 8-hour day. Okay, and Marx really saw the relationship between the very militant anti-racism and anti-slavery position that had emerged in the British and broader European working class movement and was very much influencing the American working class movement as well, and then the emergence of the 8-hour day struggle at the end of the Civil War. So in Capital, Marx is very influenced by this, and he writes, in the United States of North America, Capital published in 1867, he was working on it during the Civil War. In the United States of North America, every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed so long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin, where in the black skin it is branded. But 8 hours out of the death of slavery, a new life at once arose. The first fruit of the Civil War was the 8 hours agitation that ran with the 7-leagued boots of the locomotive from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from New England to California, right? So it's actually, this sort of massive anti-racist struggle around the Civil War, which is able to break down the divisions and broaden the horizons of the US working class movement and creates the basis for the 8-hour movement that followed. You can also see in Capital the real development of the sophistication of Marx's analysis around the role of imperialism and the role of colonialism in the global capitalist system, right? So he's refining and developing this politics of working class solidarity with anti-colonial struggle that I pointed out earlier. So just to read one quote, comrades will probably be familiar with. This is from Capital, where he's talking about the process of primitive accumulation, the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, the seizure of treasure from their lands, the seizure of their land base in the so-called New World. This was a crucial component of the development of capitalism as a global system. He says the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement and entombment in the minds of the Indigenous population of that continent, the beginnings of the conquest and plunder of India, and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for the communal hunting of blackskins, all the things which characterize the dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. Okay. And in my research, right, I actually realized that Marx's very eloquent, lyrical, and insightful writing about colonial expansion in Capital provided direct inspiration for a communist named Herbert Moxon in Australia, who in 1931 authored a breakthrough pamphlet about Aboriginal oppression. Right? They wrote a program for the struggle against slavery, was the name of this program, published by the Communist Party in 1931, which goes into very close detail about the genocide that was taking place in Australia and puts forward a very sophisticated program for Indigenous liberation. they say to give, large tracts of land, return them to Indigenous ownership, recognize Indigenous self-determination, allow Indigenous people to teach in their own languages, practice their own culture, stop the forced removal of children, get rid of all racist laws which discriminate against Indigenous people. The list goes on and on, right? This was, you could have this as a program today and it would be one of the more radical, programs going around. And this was written by the communists in Australia in 1931. And I've realized that in the Workers' Weekly, the magazine, the newspaper where the program was published, in the weeks leading up, they're actually carrying excerpts from Capital where Marx is talking about Indigenous dispossession. And Herbert Moxon actually uses some of the same lyrical devices and some of this sort of breathless description of all of the crimes being perpetrated, and how this is part of establishing capitalism. He writes in the style of Marx in Capital when he's actually writing this program. So, and I know from his other writings, the extent to which he was actually studying Marx as well. So we can see that this is a very immediate and direct impact, from the actual work of Marx and Engels and their theorization to the actual emergence of, a position, a fighting position, sort of solidarity with Indigenous struggle. Okay. So probably the most profound, or I think undoubtedly actually, the most profound insights that came from Marx and Engels into the questions of, solidarity with anti-imperialist and anti-colonial struggle come in relation to the Irish question as it was discussed at the time, right? And even though we have, articles in solidarity with China, with India, with Algeria, with Indonesia, with a whole range of places where people are resisting European colonization. Marx wrote about them and Engels wrote about them on the side of the people who were resisting. It was in Ireland where the question was posed incredibly sharply for the workers' movement in Britain, because there's hundreds of thousands of Irish workers in Britain, right? Inside the metropolitan centre, and the division between Irish and British workers is a crucial tool for the ruling class in England to actually keep the working class movement divided and retain the power of the capitalist class. And in 1869, the questions posed really sharply when Fenians, so Irish independence fighters, actually set off a load of bombs, people are killed, there's a wave of arrests of Fenian leaders, and then there's massive demonstrations, 200,000 in Dublin, 100,000 in London, led by Irish workers demanding the release of the Fenian prisoners. And the question is posed to the International Workingmen's Association, what is your position on these demonstrations? What do you have to say? And Marx fought very, very hard that the IWMA needs to be shoulder to shoulder with the Irish independence struggle at this moment. Call for the release of the Fenian prisoners, call for independence for Ireland, and actually waged an argument against some anarchists within the International Workingmen's Association who said, we don't get involved in nationalism, right? We're not interested in any of this national business. You know, the working man has no country. Isn't that what you said in the Communist International? In the Communist Manifesto? What are we doing mucking around with a nationalist struggle? And Marx is really, really clear at the time that actually it's not enough for English workers to just say, well, we're all workers, we need to unite, right? It's not enough to just say we all have no country. Actually, there's an oppression of Ireland as a nationality. And if you're going to build solidarity with Irish workers, it's crucial that British workers are clear, we are against the racism that's directed against you. And that means supporting your right to actually secede, your right to actually have self-determination. So it's a dialectical insight about, in order to unite, we have to recognize your right to separate. Right, and Lenin actually took that insight into, you know, a fully theorized position, and the Communist International fully theorized that position after the First World War. But it started with Marx's writings on Ireland. So I'll just read some of it, some of the letters that he was sending at the time. He argued that the English worker cherishes the religious, social, and national prejudices against Irish workers, ideas which were artificially sustained and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling class. Elsewhere, he wrote that the split between Irish and English workers, artificially nourished and kept alive by the bourgeoisie. It knows that this split is the true secret of maintaining its power. Okay, they said that unless the Irish workers could, unless British workers could be won to a position of support for Irish independence, they would forever be kept in tether to their own rulers, right? Buying into this idea of racial superiority, that they somehow have something in common with their own rulers. And a position of support for self-determination was about breaking those racist ideas and allowing the unity that was needed to emerge. Okay, so Marx develops this position further in 1869, actually writing to the the Labor Union, the American Labor Union, a massive workers' organization that had formed in the wake of the National Labor Union, in the wake of the Civil War in the United States, right? This is now the major representative of working class people in the United States. Marx and the International Workingmen's Association were in constant contact with this organization, and a number of their branches had actually affiliated to the IWMA. Okay, so he's writing in 1869, worried about growing diplomatic tensions between America and Britain and the possibility that this might somehow spill over into war. And he writes, a second war, not hallowed by the sublime purpose and a great social necessity, but of the old world type, would forge chains for the free labourer instead of tearing asunder those of the slave. The accumulated misery left in its track would afford your capitalist at once the motive and the means of divorce from the working class from its bold and just aspirations by the soulless sword of a standing army. On you then depends the glorious task to prove to the world that now at last the working classes are bestriding the scene of history, no longer as servile retainers, but as independent actors, conscious of their own responsibility and able to command peace where their would-be masters shout war. Okay, and this was really continuing a theme from Marx's correspondence with the American movement, where he was warning about the fact that, sure, the Civil War might have been justified. We needed to put down the slaveholders, but you can't let the United States consolidate a standing army that they're going to keep as an imperialist force from here on in. So in a letter in 1865, he wrote, "We have to first congratulate you that the war is ended and the Union preserved. The stars and stripes, once rudely torn down by your own sons, again flutter in the breeze from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Never again, we hope, to be insulted by your children, or again to wave over fields of carnage, either by civil commotion or foreign war." Okay, and now I'll just pause at this point to slightly change the tack now in what I'm going to talk about just for the next 15 minutes, which is to just look a little bit more critically at the anti-imperialism of Marx and Engels at this time, and sort of tease out, you know, what I think is the argument that I make, that even though that they developed very sophisticated critique of colonialism and imperialism in general, there was a blind spot at this time about the reality of settler colonialism, and that the US Republic was in fact already an imperialist settler colonial entity, not in danger of turning into one, right? It was already an imperialist entity, and the US Army, you know, Marx was saying, you know, we hope that they never, the Stars and Stripes never again wave over fields of carnage. In reality, in 1865, the Stars and Stripes were continuing to wave over fields of carnage, change on the American West, right? There was an intense anti-insurgency war being fought by the American army, right across the West. And I think that, I don't, anyway, people are sort of wondering, why do you he didn't talk directly about native oppression, Marx, right? There's nowhere where he sort of says, oh, it's great they've gone out and killed the Indians or anything like that. I'm certainly not making an argument that Marx was in favor of anti-Indigenous violence. But what I'm trying to say is the blind spot, not recognizing that the US was in fact already imperialist, that the US Army was already out there actually forging chains for the free labourer was a blind spot, was a blind spot at this time that had real implications as well. And it came directly out of the weaknesses in the particular situation of the US workers' movement at that time. So, actually the US Army that was fighting across the American West became a very important tool for putting down the radical workers' movement. So in 1877, US Army regiments were actually redeployed from fighting against Sioux people to go to Chicago to put down militant workers' demonstrations during great insurgent strikes that were taking place at that time, right? So by not recognizing the dangers of what the US Army was doing in the American West, they actually are forging their own chains and they're allowing the creation of a force which is then deployed against the US workers' movement. This is just one of numerous, mobilizations of the US Army against mass strikes, including the suppression of the nationwide Pullman strike, by army divisions that had recently massacred Lakota men, women, and children at Wounded Knee in 1890. Okay. So just to go, I don't have that much time left, so I will just, with what I've gone, I'll go back and just have a little bit of a look and a few reflections sort of on this weak spot and how, it's sort of evident, sort of in the writings, in the writings over that broad sweep of the period I've gone through. Okay, so I mean, the reason why I think it's significant that Marx never actually discusses the phenomenon of native dispossession or native violence, anti-native violence, is that actually him and Engels are writing about America for 40 years, right? They're writing about America from 1853 all the way through to 1883. They write an enormous amount about the actual conflicts over land that were taking place between the small holders of lands that had just been taken up by new settlers and the big commercial interests, the big banks, the big, industrial companies, etc. It writes quite a lot about that conflict, that conflict over land, because actually, even though in the European context, the worker with nothing to lose but your chains is the central figure of socialist strategy, in the North American context, actually, for the first couple of decades when Marx and Engels are writing, it's the independent small farmer that looms large as the main sort of actor in the sort of revolutionary or communist movement in the United States. So the main organization that Marx and Engels say that the communists in America need to get involved with is the national reform movement that starts in the 1840s. And this was a campaign that was demanding the release of 168 lots across the continent for settlement by independent farmers. Now, what's significant about this is all of these territories are actually, Indigenous sovereignty is actually recognized by the US government at that time. Allocating those lands to settler farmers would mean breaking treaties with sovereign Indigenous people that the US is actually, in relationships with. But the workers' movement was saying, well, they weren't saying this, they were just ignoring the Indigenous people, but the stuff I'm reading is like, break the treaties and give us the land. Right? Like it's actually this view of the United States as of the North America as this empty continent, just full of these virgin soils, full of these public lands that can be divided up, amongst the settler workers. So yeah, in the Communist Manifesto, they say, you need to get involved with the national reformist movement, that it's an attack on landed property in general. Communist tendencies in America can only emerge in an agrarian form. The Communist Manifesto says, in America, where the democratic constitution has already been established, the communists must make common cause which the party which will turn this constitution against the bourgeoisie and use it in the interests of the proletariat, that is with the agrarian national reformers. Okay. So in that sort of period where in the later 1840s, where I've said that, there's these writings from Engels where he's explicitly in favor of, the colonization of Algeria by the French, similarly writes about witnessing the conquest of Mexico and rejoicing in it. The conquest of California is a war that's being waged wholly and solely in the interests of civilization. In the energetic Yankees in a few years will concentrate a dense population and extensive trade at the most suitable places on the coast of the Pacific Ocean. In some places, justice and other moral principles may be violated, but what does that matter compared to facts of such world historic significance? Or in 1850, speaking about California, one of the most beautiful and fertile areas in the world, hitherto as good as uninhabited, is visibly being transformed into a rich and civilized country. Okay, so this is just, basic sort of manifest destiny, sort of terra nullius ideology is what we call it in Australia, where you're just sort of imagining these places as being empty. They don't really have any people. They're not developed. It's a progressive thing that civilization, is sort of being established there. In the reality, what's going on in 1850 in Canada is like a horrific genocide, right? Like the US Army and settlers are killing thousands of people right there. Anyway, I don't have time to go into the detail about it. But, although, as I've sort of said, in the 1850s, they break with these ideas as it relates to the rest of the colonized world. In America, the labor movement that they're corresponding with, and there's a whole lot of German communists who've actually migrated to America after the 1848 revolution, including a number of them that go on to play very prominent positions in the Union Army. They are very much part of this whole free soil movement, this communist movement. So, the Republican Party is established in the mid-1850s in response to the Kansas confrontation. In the Kansas territory, you've got, pro-slavery settlers and anti-slavery settlers that are actually at war with each other, killing each other. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed in I think it's 1856 or a similar time, which actually allows slaveholders to bring slaves into the Kansas territory, right? And the socialists and communists are on the side of the free soilers. They're on the side of it being against slavery, but there's no recognition that Indigenous people are suffering a horrific genocide to actually establish settler-colonial occupation in Kansas. It's horrible what happens to the many Indigenous peoples who were dragged to Kansas in the first instance from being dispossessed elsewhere, and then die in very large numbers in the 1850s in the middle of this process of settler colonization. So Wedemeyer, who's one of Marx's collaborators, and one of the most radical and brilliant communists in America at the time, he's critical of the free soil movement, but his solution is for there to be socialized, collectivized farms set up by the new state of Kansas, right? So maybe some other comrades have done some more research into the American socialist movement at that time. I didn't have the chance to look really, really closely at it, unfortunately. But what I could see is there's no cognizance or no recognition really that there's still Indigenous struggles for these lands. It's seen as public lands, and the debate is about the terms on which it's going to be colonized. And I think that's how Marx basically writes about the struggles over land in North America and Australia in Capital, in chapter 33 of Capital. There's quite a lengthy actually discussion of struggles around property in the settler colonies. And I won't have time to sort of read them out, but Marx makes a very cogent case, really, that all these socialists in America think that they're going to be able to escape capitalism by setting up some sort of small little utopian project somewhere. They're mad. That's not going to happen. Capitalism's not going to allow it to happen, right? They're going to attack the small holdings. They're going to force them into the labor market. And of course, that is exactly what happened, right? So Lincoln sets up the Homestead Act in 1862, grants huge amounts of Indigenous land to settlers. And within a decade, most of it's in the hands of wealthy industrialists, and is super concentrated in the hands of the capitalist class. So Marx was right that you can't get socialism by going and setting up some little utopian project on the frontier. What Marx missed in his writings was that actually Indigenous people were resisting this reality, that there was another actor in politics in a settler-colonial context, and that is the Indigenous people who were sort of resisting and fighting, for their land at the time. And as I've gone over, that has implications in terms of the US Army and US nationalism is able to actually consolidate. But yeah, again, I don't want to get into it like this is some, Marx is writing about a whole range of things all over the world, right? So it's not that Marx is, some particularly nasty racist or anything like this. I think, as I've said, that, writings of Marx are very, very crucial for being able to actually articulate and understand why working people need to stand with colonized people in their resistance. I just think it is important to sort of reflect upon, what were the actual weaknesses of the workers' movement in that time that sort of kept blinkers on and maybe didn't allow socialists to see the full implications, of what a struggle for liberation sort of actually looks like in a settler colonial context. Okay, and just in the few minutes I've got left, I just want to sort of talk briefly about the period later in Marx's life, when I think, he really does, start becoming very, very interested in the anthropology that's coming out at this time from a whole lot of colonial situations all around the world. From the later 1870s, Marx is sort of like devouring all these ethnographers, and you can go and read Lawrence Crater's put together a little collection of his notebooks called the Ethnological Notebooks, where Marx is actually making notes on a whole lot of different ethnologists. And what's really very, very interesting for me when you go and read it is the way that Marx clearly understands the extent to which the ethnological arguments, the anthropological arguments and conceptions that were alive at the time were a function of imperialism, right? So all these anthropologists that were out there making notes on the indigenous people, they had ideas of European superiority, which fundamentally distorted what they were writing and what they were seeing. And that is all the way through Marx's notes, right? So he's making little notes as he goes. I'll see if I've actually written any of them here. I've got, for example, Marx extracted a passage from British ethnologist John Lubbock arguing for the spiritual superiority of the higher races. This was Lubbock. Lubbock cited another author's account of a friend in Australia who was trying in vain to convince an Aboriginal man about the existence of a soul that couldn't leave the body and ascend to heaven. Marx the materialist mocked Lubbock as a fool and the friend as an ass, in contrast to the intelligent black who would not keep his countenance, right? So you can see when you're reading between the lines and reading these notes, is Marx is mocking these, pretensions of superiority, and his loyalties are consistently with the colonized people, who are there. Marx is also very, very clearly broken by this stage with any sort of unilinear conception of social development. He actually explicitly writes to reject any grand historical theories of historical development, right? He says there's no one way that history is moving, from feudalism automatically towards capitalism or anything like this. There's possibilities for social development, are heterogeneous, right across the world. And he actually makes an argument against Russian socialists who are saying that we need to support capitalism in breaking up the collective forms of land tenure and collective forms of working the land that some peasant communes had in Russia. We need to break them up and support capitalism in breaking them up in order to provide a basis for socialism. Marx says this is rubbish, right? We already have a basis for socialism in the creation of capitalism in Western Europe. If the Russian revolutionary movement can link up with the revolutionary movement in Europe, and there's an overthrow of capitalism in Western Europe, then the Russian peasant commune can actually be a point of advantage for the Russians in terms of there being a form of collective organization that could be allowed to change and grow and evolve, alongside a revolutionary sort of socialist movement, right? So he had an insight like that in the Russian context. You can also see little hints of this when he's writing about some other indigenous struggles and other indigenous peoples. So he spent some time in Algeria late in his life, where he writes constantly about their native culture being far more egalitarian, and about how this is actually giving them, this is giving them strength, this is giving them inspiration in their struggle against French imperialism. And he says that moves, makes notes about, from some other anthropologists actually, about moves by the French legislature to try and abolish communal indigenous landholdings in Algeria were about trying to destroy the influence that actually was having on communists in terms of thinking that there were other ways of organizing property and agriculture that might be possible. Right, so it's quite interesting and dynamic sort of idea about the relationship between, collective Indigenous forms which survived that were coming into conflict with imperialism and the process of the global revolutionary and the process of the global revolutionary movement. Okay, there's one particular set of notes that Marx made from Louis Henry Morgan. Who is a major American anthropologist, who Marx was very, very clear that this guy was involved with US imperialism, right? Morgan, he says he's not at all to be suspected of revolutionary tendencies, that the American government's actually funding his work. Yeah, I'll start to wind up now. And he's critical of Morgan's politics in that regard. After Marx dies, right, Engels actually finds his notes that he's written about a whole range of anthropologists, including his very, very comprehensive notes on Louis Henry Morgan, and he transforms those into the book that we now know as The Origin of the Family. Right, which I think is a very, very important book in the socialist tradition. I think, there's an argument in there about the emergence of women's oppression alongside class society, which is a fundamental argument that we need to keep making today. It's a very, very important book in terms of the way that it, sort of blows apart the myth that, that the hierarchy and the competition and everything that is part of capitalism are somehow natural, and actually Marx in his notes constantly tried to point out the way that the effects of British imperialism in terms of the destruction of Indigenous societies are reinvented in the writings of anthropologists as being some kind of inevitability that these societies would automatically, sort of just disappear. That they're actually apologists for colonial violence rather than, objective scientists observing reality, right? So that was Marx's critique of the ethnographers. I think it's fair to say that Engels turned around and wrote Origin of the Family without any critical commentary on Morgan at all, actually, particularly what Morgan wrote about Aboriginal people in Australia, which is just what I wanted to finish on, because, yeah, I did notice in my research looking at the 1920s and the Communist Party in the 1920s, when they hadn't actually taken up anti-Aboriginal racism at all. And they were still very much in the mindset of the Australian mainstream that Aboriginal people were inferior and were destined to die out. When they went to Marx and Engels and read about anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism and anti-racism in general, there was plenty in that writing that they took on as inspiration for their struggles. But the writings about Aboriginal people that are in Engels they're actually very offensive, right? So there's, very derogatory comments about the backwardness of the Indigenous people. And there's even a suggestion in there that it's actually a process of like biological development, getting a bigger mind and, and a stronger physique, that was a precondition for the transition from what he calls savagery, sort of hunter-gatherer life, to barbarism, to the sort of the next stage of development, that was Morgan's argument. That's what Morgan sort of argued, that initial transition from savagery to barbarism contained some sort of change in the being along with, just a cultural change or a change in the, sort of the productive forces or anything like that. And that's there in the Engels, he quotes Morgan and sort of references it. Yeah, as I said, I don't want to, sort of dwell on it, but it was quite striking to me when I was reading like anthropologists in the Communist Party in the 1920s were using this stuff from Engels to basically justify like why they weren't doing anything about Aboriginal oppression in Australia, like recycling this idea that Aboriginal people are somehow backward or just destined to die out. And I think that all that does, really is it certainly doesn't say to us that, Engels is some sort of irredeemable racist. As I've said, there's a lot of really, really important stuff in Origin of the Family we need to defend. It's not about, throwing out, the tradition or saying, these, racist references in the work. I think it is about trying to actually think critically about, what was it that actually leads to the emergence of anti-racism and anti-colonial ideas in the working class movement. It's the experience of struggle. It's joint experiences of struggle where we actually develop these ideas. And it's so important, at those moments of struggle to, hold on to and generalize sort of from that thinking. And you really saw that the Communist Party in Australia took the better and more far-reaching and insightful elements of Marx and Engels' anti-racist thought, gave them the tools to overcome the limitations of the analysis of settler colonialism that had hitherto actually characterized, the communist movement across the world. So I'll just leave my comments there. I've gone for more than 45 minutes now, but yeah, more than happy for questions and discussion. Thanks a lot.
Stick around for the wrap-up after the Paddy's wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Thanks for all the comments and the discussion. It's really interesting, and yeah, it's really good to connect with you, comrades. Looking forward to more discussions going forward. Excuse me. Yeah, just to get to some of the questions and some of the discussion. The first was about this sort of the critique of Marx for being Eurocentric. I mean, look, I think it's absolutely crucial that we reject, the idea that Marx is just Eurocentric, not useful for anti-colonial struggles across the world. I mean, particularly, for the reasons that I've gone over, like the actual theoretical tools that are provided by Marx have been absolutely central for revolutionary movements right across the world, across the 20th century, and are still really, really important today. I mean, so many, anti-colonial revolutionary leaders look to Marx's writings, were inspired by Marx's writings, and that fundamental insight that says, like, actually workers in imperialist countries actually don't have anything to gain from imperialism. In fact, it's by making common cause with colonized people, by supporting their resistance, that we're actually able to liberate ourselves, I think is a really, really important, and remains, the central insight of socialist politics, along with, as people have been saying, that it's actually the power of the working class which actually has the capacity to destroy the system at all. And I mean, that's what Marx was arguing in his, chapter 33, was he was actually arguing against the whole idea that by setting up settlements on, public land, as it was called, you could somehow escape capitalism. He was saying there's no escaping capitalism. Like, the only solution is to confront it head on, go through the middle, and actually destroy the system. That's the only way forward. It's just, about sort of appreciating, where are those points of tension, where are there points of resistance that the working class movement can actually relate to, to turn up the pressure on the system and create the possibility of its overthrow. I mean, that said, I do think it's important to recognize, when you're talking about Marx's writing, is to recognize his position in the world at the time, who he was and where he was, that actually allowed him to say those things. And in that sense, it was a European movement, right? Like, he was the main intellectual of an international workingmen's association that actually wasn't that international. It was Western Europe and the United States. I mean, that was great and very, very important to be challenging be challenging the divisions of nationality or whatever that existed at the time. But it was the vision of the International Workingmen's Association as something that would actually unite people from right across the world wasn't realized until after the First World War, with the creation of the Communist International, where they actually did have delegations from colonized countries, people leading resistance movements in colonized countries right across the world, and actually needed to very explicitly break with the racism and the pro-imperialist politics that characterized the Second International, right? That was the organization that replaced the International Workingmen's Association and took the workers' movement into the First World War. And some of the most profound insights of communists who were critical of the Second International about why they actually embraced the First World War and took their constituent parties into the First World War was that, they had failed on the question of opposing colonial expansion in the earlier phase of the 20th century, because they'd accepted the ideas, many of the leaders, Kautsky, Bernstein, a whole lot of the leaders of German social democracy and elsewhere had actually accepted, that idea that's in some ways foreshadowed in the manifesto, but corrected later by Marx, that the expansion of capitalism around the world was somehow inherently a progressive thing, and that we needed to support the bourgeoisie in terms of its, efforts to expand capitalism around the world, because that would lay the basis for, revolution. By allowing the colonization of places around the world, you were allowing the basis for revolution. So that whole idea about Western superiority, European superiority, and pro-imperialism, paved the way for the First World War, and needed to be explicitly broken with and challenged by Lenin, by the Bolsheviks, by other revolutionaries in other countries who dusted off Marx went back to Marx on a whole range of ways. Lenin went back to Marx on the question of the state to write State and Revolution, went back to Marx's writings about, the French, the 1871 revolution, in order to, the Paris Commune, sorry, in order to actually, develop what he wrote in State and Revolution, went back to Marx about self-determination in Ireland in order to articulate the position, in favor of national liberation and, critical but unconditional support for national liberation movements and everything that emerged. It was by going back and drawing on those best insights, but, again, as well, okay, why was there a blind spot in terms of settler colonialism in North America? It's not because of some failing of Marx as an individual. It's because of the particular position of the workers' movement in North America at that time, the particular politics of the workers' movement in North America at that time, the uncritical attitude to the Homestead Act and, the things about, sort of setting up settlements. And that was the sort of milieu that he was communicating with. And you can't divorce him from that context. You have to understand him actually in that, in that context. So that's what I've sort of tried to do with the analysis. Just on some of what people have said about Morgan and the anthropology, and also the question of the land-based sort of philosophies, that inform Indigenous, sort of ways of life or ways of knowing. I think what's really interesting is when Marx was looking through and making copious notes about, different Indigenous cultures around the world, was at the same time when he's actually sharpening up his ecological critique of capitalism, right? These two things were going hand in hand, trying to actually look around the world and imagine different ways of being, different ways of organizing society, different ways of relating to the natural world, trying to understand the multiplicity of human life and human experience, and I think, that's what you can see in his notes that he's taking on Morgan. He's writing them out like thousands and thousands of words. He's copying out by hand of all of these really, really interesting, kinship systems that different Indigenous peoples have that were very, very linked with, totems from the natural world, the way that, like Indigenous life was integrated into relationships with animals and plant life. Like this was part of what he's actually studying. Like, why does he spend so long writing out the notes of, what Morgan's writing about the Iroquois, or writing out the notes about what Morgan's writing about the Gamilaraay here in Australia? It's because this is fascinating stuff about how people are sort of living their lives and, and relating to each other, and it's, like a source of thought and inspiration. And I do really agree that we've got a situation now where the climate catastrophe is at the center of global politics, where Indigenous people are, consistently resisting the expansion of fossil fuels on their land, consistently putting forward, alternative ways of relating to the land that actually come out of their own sustainable histories and sustainable practices. Like this is, this is part of the political world that we are now operating in. And I think there's actually some really, really dynamic and interesting stuff, like actually in, some of these, sort of writings and notebooks and Marx or whatever that can help us and inspire us as well. Yeah, and just to finish, I have sort of mentioned on it about Lenin and the Bolsheviks and what they sort of did with this, sort of with this theory. It becomes absolutely central, right? Like that idea that your job as a revolutionary, if you're in an imperialist country, is to be absolutely clear. We are for the resistance of colonized people. We are for their armed resistance. We are for the military defeat of our own, imperialist powers. This is the politics that actually stopped the massacres on the Australian frontier. That's what I argue in my thesis, that it was when the Communist Party had realized that the insights that Lenin and others, were talking about, colonization around the world and how socialists need to relate to anti-colonial struggle, when they applied that to the Indigenous situation in Australia for the first time in Australian history, it was a part of a movement that actually changed the course of Australian history. They were having meetings of hundreds of workers in the urban centres voting, we support Indigenous people killing police who come onto their lands. right? That was actually the resolutions they were carrying. We are for armed resistance of the Indigenous people who are coming onto their lands. That is straight out of Marx in the 1870s about Ireland. That is straight out of Lenin in 1917, 1918 about anti-colonial struggles. So I think that's, you know, it's about saying, like, there's this particular history about how revolutionary workers need to understand their place in the world and their responsibilities in terms of supporting anti-colonial resistance, that, you know, that are absolutely crucial, you know, have been crucial in the past, and are going to be really, really crucial for, you know, fighting for, you know, all of our liberation, you know, today as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paddy, again.